Back in May 1988, I just got married and settling into married life in a new home and really enjoying my career as a physiotherapist. And yet, just 2 weeks after our honeymoon, I woke up one morning and saw a man at the end of my bed. I remember automatically putting my hand out, and when I realised my husband was still there, I leapt out of bed shrieking, weirdly towards the man as he started leaving quickly out of the bedroom door. My husband leapt over this bed towards me, and once he was able to work out what I was trying to tell him, he raced down the stairs after the burglar and out into the road, stark naked. Unfortunately, by the time he got there, all he could see was my car being driven away with what we later realised was a whole load of my belongings. I'm sure you can imagine the sheer terror that I experienced that day. But life goes on, and after having a burglar alarm fitted that very day, we settled down and got settled into married life in our new home. Fast forward 4 months though, and it was the first time that my husband had actually left me on my own for one evening. And although I was nervous, I decided I'm going to go to bed, but I'm going to wait until I hear the van pulling up outside, and then I'll go to sleep. Of course, what did I do? But I fell asleep. And the next thing I was aware of was the bedroom door opening. This triggered a massive stress response within me, with the terror from the burglary surfacing instantaneously. But of course, when I realised it was just my husband, I was able to calm down and turn over and go back to sleep. What I didn't know then, though, was that bottled up emotions can manifest as very real physical symptoms. And even though I wasn't aware of this at the time, I certainly experienced it in a very personal way the following morning, when I woke up in absolute agony. The pain in my neck was so bad due to severe spasm in my neck muscles that the only way I could get out of bed was literally to lift the weight of my head in my hands. Now, I remember trying to work out how on earth I could possibly have injured my neck while asleep without even being aware of it. And the only way I could explain it at the time was to think, well, maybe I caused myself whiplash by suddenly turning my head when my husband walked in the room. Even though I know that we can't cause ourselves an injury by deliberately turning our heads, no matter how forcefully. But there was no other medical explanation for this at the time. Looking back, though, I'd actually gone to sleep soon after an intense acute stress response, without actually discharging any of the emotions that had actually been triggered. Now, an animal, when it's being threatened, will actually discharge its emotions by either running away from the predator or fighting the predator, or sometimes through a bodily tremor as they physically shake them off. What did I do? I rolled over and I went back to sleep. My interest in pain as a physiotherapist began many years into my career. But the more experience I gained, the more baffled I became by a number of things. For example, I wondered why so many people presented with chronic pain, and yet they hadn't had an actual injury. And if they had, it was something completely innocuous, like, I don't know, bending over and picking up a pen or turning over in bed. Many of my patients had already had numerous tests done, medical tests done, ruling anything physical out as a cause. And I examined them, and I couldn't find a physical cause for their pain. And even when the pain could be attributed or had been attributed to something, let's say a curvature of the spine or a bulging disc, then I wondered why they got better with my very gentle treatments when this physical abnormality was still there. And even when there had been a particular physical incident that had triggered the pain, I wondered why. Because often this was something they did without any problem. So as a personal example of this, I used to get my car out of the garage every morning before I went to work. And yet every now and again, when I actually lifted the garage door up, my neck would go, and I'd be in pain for a week or two or more. I don't think actually that I ever questioned why I had pain that day and not the previous day, or any of the days in the previous few weeks. I think actually I was too busy blaming the weight of the garage door, or to be more honest, actually blaming my husband for not putting a strong enough spring on the door. Finally though, through frustration, determination, and a large dose of tenacity, while trying to find an answer to all these issues, I came across the work of Dr. John Sarno. Now, Dr. Sarno was a professor of rehabilitation medicine in New York, and like me, he'd become disillusioned with the poor outcomes of people with chronic pain. He realized through his education and his experience, he'd been corralled into a very narrow view of his patients' ailments. And they weren't taking into account any of his own observations. It seems that often we're bound by things that we don't know, rather than things we do know. So what was it that this American doctor found that was so groundbreaking? Well, back in the 1970s, he identified that 88% of his patients who presented with chronic pain had at least one stress-induced condition. So, for example, a tension headache or heartburn or irritable bowel. He also realized that although many of his patients presented with spinal degeneration on MRI scans, very often the symptoms his patients presented with didn't actually match the findings on the scans. But this is a very small and very important but. Had MRI scans ever been undertaken on people who didn't have pain? Actually, no. Not until the mid-1990s. And since then, there have been a growing number of studies demonstrating that spinal degeneration is prevalent in people who don't have any pain at all. So I'm sorry to say this, but actually, from the age of 20, our bodies begin to physically degenerate. So by the time you're all 50, 80% of you will have disc degeneration, and 60% of you will have bulging discs. But there's nothing actually to worry about, because these are just physical changes that happen with age, like grey hair or wrinkles. Back in 2011, a UK osteopath actually reviewed a number of studies. And he looked at the studies that have been focusing on back pain. And his results were really interesting, because he was actually unable to find any link between pain and poor posture, spinal degeneration, or biomechanical factors. For example, poor core stability. But it's not just about back pain either, because actually there have been a number of studies using MRI scans on teams of elite athletes who didn't have pain. And the findings were that 40% of the baseball players had torn or ruptured tendons in their dominant arms. In the basketball players, nearly 50% of them had torn cartilages in their knees. And wait for it, 77% of the ice hockey players actually had pathological changes, or rather wear and tear, in their hips and groins. Now, we can probably imagine that ice hockey players or any elite players like this will be putting more demand on their joints, and therefore probably more likely to have wear and tear than the general population. But remember, these athletes did not have any pain. So you might be thinking I'm saying that pain's all in the head. Well, absolutely not, unless you mean the brain. Because, of course, the brain is in the head. But all pain is processed by the brain. And our perception of pain is affected by a number of things. For example, what's happening right now, our previous experiences, our fears, beliefs, and even our expectations. We know through pain science that pain is actually due to neural pathways that become learned and sensitized. We also know that pain is not linked to tissue damage. Now, this can be explained, for example, if you've ever broken a bone. I've certainly broken a leg. It can be extremely painful. But what's interesting is once the bone is protected with a plaster cast, the pain settles down very quickly and well before the bone actually heals. And also, if somebody's had a limb amputated, they can sometimes get something called phantom limb pain. So this is the perception of pain in the limb that they don't actually have any longer. Catastrophic injuries like severe tissue trauma in a war zone is often not initially painful. And this is because the brain's primary function is for life preservation. And only when the individual is safe will the pain pathways be switched on. This allows the focus to be on life preservation and then to move towards protecting the injured area from further damage. So in effect, chronic pain is part of our protective or stress response in response to a threat. Now, the threat might be very real, as in an angry dog attacking us, or it might be perceived, as in my response when I heard my husband coming into the bedroom door, even though he was not a threat to me. So I hope you can now see that sometimes unresolved emotional pain can manifest in physical pain. But one of the things that actually helped, one of the other things that actually was baffling me at the time was that often, for example, many of my patients would actually present with pain and they'd had severe tissue trauma recovered, and people with less trauma or no injury at all, the pain persisted. And it made me wonder, if pain is related to tissue trauma, why does the pain persist when the tissues have healed? And there are a number of factors related to that, but none of them include the extent of the tissue damage. In fact, they include, for example, whether the individual was feeling anxious or depressed at the time of the injury, whether they'd lost hope for the future, or whether they'd had negative beliefs about pain being permanent, and also whether they'd had previous trauma. And this last one is interesting because I would suggest it's not very common for somebody presenting for treatment with chronic pain to be asked if they've experienced previous trauma. And yet the evidence demonstrating, for example, that the strong link between adverse childhood experiences and ill health, including chronic pain in later life, has been around for about 20 years. Unfortunately, it's not very well known. It's only just now becoming more well known, and yet the link is irrefutable. Now, I'm not saying that everybody with chronic pain has had previous trauma, obviously. But what I am saying is that we as health professionals must consider this in order to be able to provide the most appropriate treatment and also give them the best chance of recovery. Now, we also know through the studies that pain can be triggered by current stressful lifestyle experiences. Now, the factors at play here include our personalities, our beliefs, and the behaviours we learned as we were growing up. Now, Dr. Sarno picked up on this because he recognised that most of his patients with chronic pain had certain personality traits, and these included being a people pleaser, having a need to be good and perfect, being overly self-critical, and overly conscientious. And these actually are really important because many of these actually mean that we can create an awful lot of self-induced stress through these traits. And our perception of stress is more about how we deal with what's going on rather than what is actually going on. So unresolved emotional pain can manifest in physical pain, but these are just a signal that there's something unresolved that we haven't dealt with. Unfortunately, without this awareness, too often these signals get missed. And just as if somebody knocks at the door and no one comes, you'll knock louder. So pain that might start with a twinge or an ache will develop and get stronger and can present as pain if the underlying signal is missed. So the system that warned us to fend off a saber-toothed tiger, it seems it's morphed to warn us of emotional dis-ease, as it tries to protect us from what it perceives to be very dangerous emotions. So the body is as phenomenal as ever. It's just that the human race has been so busy trying to change things on the outside that it's ignored and been distracted from the signals and emotions that are within us. Consequently, recovery from chronic pain can come about once a more serious cause has been ruled out, can come about through education and self-empowerment. Simple strategies such as learning to become emotionally aware, learning to safely express how we feel can all help in our recovery, whether that's due to past or current stressful situations. Learning how to become self-compassionate, how to self-soothe and to regulate our emotions can all help as we become more resilient. Finally, there is hope and optimism for us all as we face the inevitable stress in our lives. And I urge you to listen to your bodies rather than just to have to deal with the pain that will manifest and persist if the signals are ignored. So, next time you have an unexplained twinge in your wrist or your back, or you have a migraine or irritable bowel, rather than talking about your pain, pause, and with all the self-compassion, the maternal compassion you can muster, say to yourself, how am I feeling? And on a very simple level, I would suggest that rather than reaching for a painkiller, you actually pick up a pen and paper, or you pick up your laptop, and you offload freely about how you feel for 10 to 20 minutes. There is a significant amount of evidence showing the health benefits of journaling. And you never know, this might be the tonic that you and your body need in the face of the 21st century saber-toothed tiger.